So what I want to touch on this morning around governance, I'm hoping this will help with some of the initial sections in the workbook, and just to give you a bit of perspective around how this is done in other parts of the world. I've reduced the slides I'm going to present here just for time. I think it's more important that that you get a chance to work on your roadmaps and I get a chance to get around and talk to those people I said I would. So I've hidden some of the slides, but they'll be in the full slide deck when you go and look at it later on. The bits I've skipped is where I get into more detail about how different countries have actually implemented different sort of governance structures. But you'll see that in there. You don't need me to talk to all of that. So to give you a bit of an overview, I know governance is kind of a very general term, but in this respect, I'm talking about the institutional arrangements, so the sort of policies and procedures that you have, so that you have a very clear division of roles and responsibilities. I think that's the most critical part. Things don't happen unless you have a lead. You have someone who's taking the lead to deliver something. They're responsible for it. And we often find, so I personally don't like strategies if they don't have an action plan associated with it. A strategy on its own is not going to get results. You need an implementation plan, and you need to have someone who is responsible for leading on each of the actions that are in it. So there's formal and informal ways of doing that. And the UN-GGCE, some might argue, is a formal mechanism because it's a coming together of member states, but there's no resources that are committed to it. So I would actually consider some of the working groups that fall underneath it are relatively informal because there's no dedicated resources that are there to make sure that the work gets done. So what you'll find is through our interactions with you, sometimes they're relatively informal. And again, that's where I like to come back to the roles and responsibilities. I think even if it's informal, you can still have someone who is taking the lead on making sure that you have the delivery of something within the roadmap. If we focus around the roadmap, that's something that you can do. You can include who you think is the lead and who is responsible for the delivery of certain actions in that roadmap. The other thing you'll notice for those countries who have been involved in UN-GGCE, which is the Integrated Geospatial Information Framework, this might be new to some of you, but I know it's known to a lot of you. What you will see for those who are familiar with this structure is that there's a lot of similarities between the roadmap and what's here, and that's not by accident, it's by design. When we've designed the roadmap, we're making sure that we're considering all of these components. There's a governance component, policy and legal, financial, data, innovation, standards, partnerships, capacity and education, and communication. The only thing the roadmap's probably missing is the innovation part, and that's because I'm really trying to get you to focus on what needs to be done now. You can then add to that in the future to think about how could you do that into the future, and what other techniques could you use to try and resolve that. For those of you who aren't familiar with the IGIF, this is a structure that's been set up within UN-GGCE to help you understand the range of things that you need to consider when you're working on geospatial projects, the development of spatial data infrastructures in your country. All of these concepts are very common within UN-GGCE. And as you can see, to solve the problems, there needs to be recognition that you can't do it on your own and you can't do it just using data. You need to be working across a whole range of different areas. So there's, for those who are interested, there is a lot of documentation related to the IGIF. There's strategies, there's implementation guides, and then there's country action plans that have been developed on the website. And this is looking at it from a very broad perspective of what is done for spatial data in countries. You could almost think of the roadmap as being a specific implementation of the IGIF for Geodesy, for your geospatial reference system. So good governance has a whole range of different things related to it when it comes to a country's geospatial reference system to make sure that it's going to be accurate, sustainable, widely adopted, and effectively managed. So you might consider yourselves as being primarily focused on accuracy. We want to have a geospatial reference system in our country that's accurate. But I've talked to a number of you, including, I know, Charisma in particular, your focus and your concern is we want to make sure it's sustainable. Like, what if we're not here? Who's going to take over this into the future? That sustainability aspect is very important. There's other countries where, Patanya, we were talking about the widely adopted. It might be being used in certain sections of government, but is it being used by everyone in government? It might be the case that it's not yet. And then how is it going to be managed? So this is where governance really comes in. And it might not be something that you're particularly interested in, but if you're not covering all these areas and thinking about it from a broad perspective, then something that's accurate on its own, if it's not being used, was it really worth the effort? So there's a few things you need to consider, and there's things like strategy, policy, and legal framework. And we've talked about this. Ryan gave us some great examples of trying to link to the government's priorities at the time, big government policies. How do you get things like Geodesy listed in government policy or regulations? I've got an example of that at the end. And then what legal frameworks do you need to have set up to make sure that it can be installed correctly? So I won't cover those dot points in a bit too much detail. I'd rather show you with an example at the end, but that's just when you go back in your reading, that's what I'm talking about when it comes to legal frameworks. We then talked about international standards. I think you've seen the value of trying to align with those where possible. International collaboration and compliance. I think, and I hope that you've seen the value of getting together with partners, particularly colleagues from different regions, and the need to rely on each other for help and support. UN-GGCE can help with that, and the centre can help with that. By being involved in these kind of organisations and being involved in other organisations like FIG or IAG, you'll also get a chance to network and meet a range of people. I think sometimes as geodesists or geospatial professionals, you can feel like you're a bit on your own within your country. And our biggest allies are sometimes people from other countries where we can get support from each other. So I think these international networks and collaboration are very important for us. I'm going to skip over some of this. I think some of it can be taken as read. It's useful for you in the future, but coordination and collaboration are critical. Funding and sustainability, that's what you're all interested in, and that's what you're here for. Building up that awareness across government around how a robust or reliable geospatial reference system is going to support all these applications. We heard about this in your country reports. You're well aware of the influence that can have across a whole range of different sectors. Another critical part is risk management, and that's a bit that often gets overlooked. I think in particular, we're looking at this from a global perspective at the moment. We're talking about VLBI and SLR and the locations of these stations around the world and the lack of this information in the Southern Hemisphere. There's nowhere internationally that this is on a risk management plan globally. We don't have an organization to handle the complexities of these discussions. So that's as much of an issue at the global scale as it is at the local and regional scale. Some of the groups you should consider, you might remember the other day I was talking about the joint development plan on global geodesy that we released, and that first action in there that's critical is to have a national committee or a national working group where you're bringing together all of the different groups who are involved in either needing support from the datum or needing to provide data to create a high accuracy horizontal, vertical datum transformation parameters as part of your system. These are just some dot points of the groups that you might want to consider when you get home to touch base with, and ask them if they would be willing to join a group, working group, committee to be a geodesy working group or committee within your country. It doesn't have to be a new committee. You might already have a group that talks about this from a geospatial perspective, or from some other perspective across government and industry. But you want to make sure that geodesy is on the agenda as part of those discussions. So I think it goes without saying that you want to have land management authorities involved in that. They're one of the critical stakeholders, and if you're looking to upgrade or modernize your geospatial reference system, they have to be sitting at the table with you. Water authorities, particularly them relating to your geoid model. If you're looking to get support for an improved geoid model, you want to have the water authorities on board. Defense Department. You may be strongly related to them. There's some parts of, I know across Asia, where it's geodesy is strongly linked with defense. It's very similar in Eastern Europe. We found that a lot of the defense departments are in control of the geodetic programs. That can be a good thing and a bad thing. It can be bad when it comes to data sharing or getting access to data or working with between the civil and the defense side. But from a budgetary point of view, they often have bigger budgets than the land mapping side. So either way, whether you're in there or out of there, you need to be engaged with them. And I'd recommend inviting them to the table and making sure that you explain to them why geodesy is relevant to them. They may not be immediately aware of the significance of it, particularly if they're from outside. If the geodesy or the mapping area is control of geodesy and it's not within defense, you're going to have to get them on board and help them understand the relevance. Air services, we covered that a lot the other day. I think that goes without saying that you want them engaged from what we talked about. Maritime services, don't forget about them, particularly for the Pacific Island countries. As Andrew likes to tell me, we're not small island developing states, they're big ocean states. Maritime is a key sector. Safety, port operations, that's where a lot of your food supply is coming from. You want to make sure that you've got maritime services engaged in these discussions. They're going to be a big player. For those of you who have space agencies, and many do around the room, get them engaged. Help them understand that measuring that wobble of the Earth is critical for satellite operations. Get them to recognize the relevance of geodesy. Don't assume that they do recognize it. We've already demonstrated that a lot of the GNSS providers don't understand the value of these ground operations and the work that are done within universities and science organizations around the world and the over-dependence on volunteer effort and in-kind support. We need to stop that. So get involved, talk to the space agencies. Standards communities, we've covered that in a lot of detail. Data stewardship, there's often teams within your organizations that are responsible for this. Get in touch with them, get their assistance. Hopefully they might be able to help you and they might be very keen to help you and take some of that responsibility off you when it comes to data storage and data stewardship and archiving into the future. Metrology. That's a critical one when it comes to setting standards in your country for either positioning or timing. The example I'd come back to is that for an example from Australia, there's the National Measurement Institute, which is another part of government, and they're responsible for defining what the recognized value standard for position is in Australia. Now, we work with them very closely to try and define that standard in Australia, but they can't do it on their own and we can't do it without them. So you may want to investigate whether such an agency exists in Australia and how that is done in your particular country. And I'd encourage you to get in touch with them. They're often the group that are involved in timing. And at the moment, there is a lot of discussions around the importance of accurate timing information in order to ensure that critical infrastructure operations keep working, because critical infrastructure, power supplies, telecommunications networks, they are very dependent on precise timing, whether it's coming from satellite or land-based. A lot of that is related to geodesy. A lot of that is probably dependent on satellite geodesy at the moment. And you may not have a strong connection with them if that exists within your country. So go and explore that. Bring in the policy people. We ran an event last year in April where we brought together policy, defense, and science organizations in Bonn as part of an expert consultation session. We had people there from Department of Defense organizations around the world, Homeland Security organizations, policy departments, and a lot of them didn't know or didn't even know how to say the word geodesy before the event. But that was critical to helping them get a stronger understanding of how the impact it has on people's daily lives. and taking a very complex science like geodesy and translating into a language they can understand. That's not going to happen in one meeting, but you need to have those people on board coming along to meetings regularly so that they understand how critical infrastructure systems and social benefits derived from geodesy are dependent on a supply chain and that you are a critical part of that supply chain. So get them involved. Then funders and donors. If you're looking at things like the National Science Foundation in the US play a critical role in making sure that things like the VLBI network continue to operate. So are there funders and donors like that around your country that might be able to provide you with assistance as well? It may not need to come directly from your budget, it could come from theirs. Range of capacity development education groups. So in this case, it'd be in the Pacific. How do I make sure that it may not be Andric, but it might be one of Andric's colleagues is sitting on your committee in your country to make sure you've got a link through to how you're going to improve capacity development education. You may not be able to do it on your own, but you can bring in these regional organizations to provide you with assistance. Could you get people from the universities? Can you get a Chris McAllister involved in these discussions? Someone like that from your region who can be involved in giving you information about what's currently going on within the university sector or the education sector. And then importantly, the Indigenous communities as well. Can you make sure that you have that connection strong from the start? Because there's nothing worse than realizing that you need access to a certain part of your country and you can't get it because they haven't been involved in the discussion from the start. You need to recognize that it's they have land rights and you've got to integrate their important traditional knowledge. I know that's a big part. TK has been massive in what they've done in the COSPAC program in the Pacific around climate change. And they're seeing big benefits from having strong traditional knowledge components built in to their program from the start. I think being inclusive and having that diversity of thought as part of the design of your programs and the establishment of your committees is critical. And so I'd recommend considering that when you set these up. In terms of a simplified structure, how it can look is you could have something like a steering committee. So this would be very senior level support. They're not the people who are going to be doing the work. This would be more senior representatives in your country. And the reason that you need that senior steering committee is because eventually you're going to need a budget and you're going to need champions. And that's the way that you engage with those groups. So you need senior level leaders within your government that you're reporting into. Now, as I said, that doesn't need to be a new steering committee. You may want to find a steering committee that already exists that is doing something related to geodesy. And you may want to see if you can establish some sort of implementation group, a working group or committee that can report into that group. So you could be an additional group, working group that sits under an existing steering committee. It doesn't need to be a new one. And then within your implementation committee, you can have working groups. So you could have a first working group on the development of a new geodetic datum. You could have another one around geode model development. You could have another one around capacity development that you're looking to do in your country. So that's the kind of rough structure that you need. So go back and have a look at what currently exists and determine, is there a steering committee that is somewhat aligned with what we're doing that would consider this to be important? It could be a steering committee around critical infrastructure operations, or it could be something around a geospatial committee that you could then establish some sort of implementation group underneath and then have working groups that fall out underneath that. As you're thinking about this as well, don't feel like you're on your own. If you've got ideas or concepts, there's a spot for this in your roadmap. Start thinking about ideas about what might work. Just write them down, jot them down in your roadmap, and then send it through to us in the center. I'll be more than happy to have a look at it and give you some feedback as to whether or not I think that's a good structure or a good link through to the right people. And then we can help you craft a message as to how you can send an email to that steering committee to say, this is what we want to do. We're looking for your support. Because you can imagine you're going to have to push a little bit. They're not going to just be grateful the fact that you are trying to give them more work. You're going to have to explain why it's of relevance to them and why they can't say no. So that's where the communications message comes in as well. And we can assist you in trying to write those emails. You can map out your stakeholders using something like this, as it's shown in the roadmap as well, influence versus interest. And if they are high in both, they're the best ones. And your communication strategy will vary depending on whether they're influential and interested, and to what degree. So it's a good exercise to go through just to make sure that you're not forgetting anybody. And if you go back through those dot points I showed before, that will be enough to get you started to try and identify who are the people in those sections that we've got the dot points for, like metrology, policy and legal, defense, water. You can start to map this out. And in your particular country, you can determine how much influence and interest they have. And then there's some advice there on the ways that you can engage and keep those people up to date with your activities. Internationally, we have as I mentioned, there's the UN-GGCE, Global Geospatial Information Management. This is really the strongest link that we currently have from a international governance perspective, from a geodesy point of view. It doesn't cover all of the players when it comes to geodesy, though. It's very much still focused on geospatial mapping, digital twins. That's part of who we work with from a geodesy point of view, but there's not a strong connection there with the space agencies, defense representatives. So in UN language, there's a reason that it's at in the first week of or second week of August every year. It's normally because that's when the UN shuts down. It's the only time that this committee of experts is able to get in and have its meeting. So we're lucky that we have something. We have some international governance, but compared to other specialized agencies within the United Nations or ECOSOC or WMO that have their Congress every year, every 4 years, this is a relatively weak group. It's a committee of experts. There's not a very strong secretariat compared to some of the other agencies. So although we're grateful to have something, I'm also recognizing that we don't have the international governance we need to generate the change that we need, because there's not the amount of support, there's not the amount of resourcing and money behind it. Having said that, it's also the best we've got, and you've got to take small steps. That's often how international governance takes place. So we need to take advantage of the fact that we do have an international governance organization within the UN, and it's providing us with connections amongst each other, and also connections with other UN institutions that we can try and strengthen those arrangements with. So I would be encouraging you to get involved in UN-GGCE, be aware of what's happening within UN-GGCE. Our Centre of Excellence and the Geospatial Knowledge Centre in Deqing in China both came out of the fact that member states recognise more needed to be done on geodesy and more needed to be done to assist countries implementing the UN-IGIF. So we now have dedicated resources for geodesy and IGIF activities because of this committee of experts. So there are small steps being made, and that's only going to continue if we get member states engaged in these groups. So I'd say understand its limitations, but also look at the opportunities that come from bringing these countries together. And here's just a range of the different groups that are available. As I mentioned, there's a high-level group on the IGIF, Integrated Geospatial Information Framework. There's a subcommittee on geodesy. How many of you know whether or not your country has a subcommittee on geodesy representative? Put your hands up, please. That's not great, is it? I think I see 2 hands. So there's currently 42 member states that have representatives on the subcommittee on geodesy, and I think there's about 13 from the Asia Pacific region. That's an opportunity. There's a subcommittee on geodesy under the UN. Wouldn't it be good to be involved in that? Yeah? if you'd like to be. Sorry, Hennessy.
We wanted to be involved in it, but it's almost always the higher ups who attends committee meetings with UNGGIM.
This is for the in-person meeting in New York, do you mean?
Not just the in-person meeting in New York, but some of the meetings with UNGGIM were attended by a different set of officers that are not really involved in Geodesy.
Okay, that's good to know. When it comes to the subcommittee, the secretariat for the subcommittee is currently us in the center. So if you're interested in being involved in the activities, I can speak on behalf of the co-chairs. They are always happy to have, even if you're not in there as a member status, the reality is that observer status is open to everybody. The UN will never turn anyone away from attending a meeting. So, and a lot of the subcommittee activities are happening online. So yes, there is a meeting once a year in New York, but the reality is if you are interested in understanding what is happening at an international level and you want to be involved in these discussions, all you need to do is let me know and I'll make sure that you're included in the discussions that are happening at the international level. And if that helps strengthen your networks and gives you a connection through to that an international community within the UN, then we're happy to support that. So please have a look into that and consider that. It's a wonderful group of people who are involved in that subcommittee, and it's all volunteer effort. They're all doing it like you are. The co-chairs and all the bureau members, they're all doing this essentially in their spare time most of the time. So they're all in the same position as you. And there's from a mix all around the world. So it's a great opportunity. Please have a look into that and let me know if you're interested. There's also some great expert groups. Very pleased to have Victor here with us, who's done a lot of wonderful work on the expert group on land administration and management. We have works on the integration of statistical and geospatial information, disaster risk management, policy and legal frameworks, marine geospatial information. Yeah, there's a whole host. So there may be a range of different areas that you might want to have different government representatives working across some of the different working groups, or at least engaged and listening to what's happening across these working groups. There's an opportunity there. So let me know if you're interested. If it's not me who's providing that secretariat role for each of these working groups, I know the person who is, so I can help connect you. From an international perspective, I just wanted to sort of summarize where we're up to at the moment. What are we missing from an international perspective? We have some dedicated resources, but we need more. We're missing a lot if you're going to be looking to solve this whole global geodesy supply chain issue. We're missing things like capital funding, operational funding. If you're looking at it from your national budgets, you probably have an OPEX and a CAPEX budget, and sometimes you're normally lacking in one or the other. We really lack a global strategy and work plan. That's the biggest issue. There's no cohesion, no coordination when it comes to determining what ground observatories do we need to model and measure the Earth, what data analysis capabilities do we need, what product development capabilities do we need, and what needs to be done to support them. If you mention this to people, they just assume that this has all been sorted. They think it's already in place. They think there's no problems. And the reason they think that is because it hasn't failed. So far, it hasn't failed. But it's also not reliable. A lot of this geodesy used to be a very sort of esoteric science. It used to be something about measuring the Earth over time, understanding its size and shape, and sure, it helped with things like navigation. But over time, particularly since the advent of satellite geodesy, we're now using it and applying it in our everyday lives. And that has all those applications have grown from this esoteric science. But what hasn't grown with it is the governance structures that come with it. So what we're looking at the moment is looking to do, this is not necessarily to say we would try and mirror this one for one, but look at the structures where this is done well at the moment. This is the World Meteorological Organization that I mentioned the other day. Just broadly speaking, if you look at the left-hand side, this is very much the policy component. And you could kind of consider this being the role that the UN-GGCE currently provide. They deal with the policy matters, and they have regional organizations like Basara mentioned the other day around UN-GGCE Asia Pacific and the role that it plays. And then on the right-hand side, that's the scientific side, the more technical side. And you could kind of consider that some of the work that's done on that side is done by the International Association of Geodesy and maybe a little bit of what FIG do. So some of that is covered on the right-hand side. But at the moment, we don't have that structure to bring that together and have something like an executive council that is dealing with these matters and looking at the problems across both and trying to problem solve. And we don't have dedicated resources to do that. And we don't have that regular Congress to get together and make decisions on how you're going to progress that strategy and implementation for the future. So there's a real opportunity there to design something else for the future, which is going to have a stronger governance mechanism to bring together the science and the policy and have dedicated resources to drive that change that we need. So something that we're working on at the moment within the centre is that the design of an options paper to look at models like this and other models that are being used internationally, and to provide you as the member states with a range of options as to how you could establish a stronger international governance organisation, international government organisation for the future. And then it would be up to you as the member states to circulate that and discuss it internally, hopefully amongst your national working groups and steering committees, to decide what actions do you want to take to make change to try and strengthen this global geodesy supply chain in the future. And then it will be the member states who will be deciding what process you want to take. The last thing I wanted to touch on is just a short example on the legislation and regulations. And for those of you who looked at the Australian fact book that we started on a couple of days ago, you'll notice that a lot of the words have come out of here. So this is the National Measurement Institute, National Measurement Regulations based on the work of the National Measurement Institute that I mentioned before. So they have these things called determinations, and they define what the datum is in Australia. Now, you don't need to read the specific information there. It's already in the fact book that you've been given from Australia. But you can just see that it clearly articulates what is the datum in Australia. What is the datum based on? These coordinates. These are the coordinates. There's 109 coordinates, and it has X, Y, Z coordinates, their uncertainties, their velocities, and the velocity uncertainty. Very clearly defined. That's what defines the Australian datum. And if you want to define it with respect to the GRS 80, this is how you do it. And if you want to work in a time-dependent reference frame, you apply that number. Now, this looks simple when it's written on the page, but it was very hard to get it down to explaining it as clearly as this. And I think that's what you were finding when we started looking at this with your activities the other day. Some of you say, oh, we have this information. It's in this 50-page manual. But can you take that 50 pages and reduce it down to these sort of 10 or 11 dot points with a table of coordinates that defines the datum in your country? That's the challenge. That's what I'd encourage you to try and do with your fact book. And that's why it's action 1.1. Because until you can do that, you're going to really struggle to be able to explain why it's important and why you need to transition to another one. So go back and have a look at the Australian fact book and try and use that as a model that you're trying to get to. It doesn't need to be defined with as many dot points as what we have, but you need to be able to clearly articulate what reference ellipsoid do you have, what version of ITRF or local spheroid are you based on? Is it static or is it time dependent? That's what I'd challenge you to do. And I really would like to see some copies of those fact book come into my inbox with what you think the current state is and get my feedback, because I want to give you my feedback. So please work on those and send them through to me, because I think action 1.1, it's there for a reason. You need to be able to define this if you're going to be able to move forward in modernizing your geospatial reference systems in your country. All right, so I'll stop there, and happy to take any questions before we move back into your roadmaps and your fact books for the rest of the morning. Thanks. All right, clear as mud, is it? That's good. That's the case. Okay, Richard.
Yeah, I think the case for the Philippines is also replicated, especially in PNG, because I mean, obviously, if you have representation on the UN from a country, a member state, often that's the cherry picking goes on within the government to say, oh yes, I'm a secretary of this department, so therefore I'm an expert. It's often not the case. It's not a technical person that goes to those specialist subcommittees. It's a bureaucrat.
We do find, though, the representatives who are on the subcommittee on geodesy, that may not be the person who always gets to come to the New York meeting, but the representatives we have on the subcommittee they're always technical people, because the bureaucrats often don't want to be involved in those meetings. They're technical discussions. It's a subcommittee on geodesy. So yes, we need a letter from someone within the government to say, this is our new representative on the subcommittee on geodesy. But the reality is that I can't recall ever getting an application from someone who was a bureaucrat, because we don't give you any money. It means you got to attend meetings and you got to talk about geodesy. So if you think you know of someone who would be a great representative from your country, please let us know. We can invite you along to those meetings. That's fine. All right, you're all super keen to get back into your fact books and roadmaps, so you go for it. I'll be wandering around, and so will a few other people, including Ryan, to help with any questions that you have. Thanks, everyone.